Right, today we're going to have a little bit of a discussion. And in the meantime, I'm going to aggressively eat biscuits. I'm having a dilemma. I have a very big problem. See, I was trying to make a video for you guys about my favourite science fiction books. And I discovered a plot hole in my life, and it has to do with genre. We're going to call this the genre debate, okay? These biscuits are delicious. So, what was my problem, you're asking? Eventually, after many hours of stressing over this issue, I discovered that there are maybe about 55 books out of the 400 books that I've read on Goodreads that classify as sci-fi. Whilst I predominantly read fantasy books, the balance is very off. And I don't know if you've ever done this, if you like to obsess over your genres like I do, but I fell into the spiralling hole of what defines a subgenre and what defines a main genre. So today, let's just clarify this. Firstly, I have recently made a video on how to define fantasy versus sci-fi, but more specifically, the three main subgenres of fantasy that I enjoy. I'll link that below. I recommend maybe having a watch of that video to understand my mindset of what defines fantasy before we get into my problems with the sci-fi world and also a bit of the fantasy world, because then maybe this won't be so confusing. The purpose of this video is not to give you an answer, and I don't think I'm going to find an answer, but it's more going to be a really long video of problems. Problem number one. What are main genres? What makes a genre a main genre? What makes it the umbrella? There is a term called speculative fiction, and if you're not familiar with it, that is the god of umbrella terms for the three umbrella terms we use the most. This is already going terribly wrong. We've got to keep this clear. Speculative fiction is a bubble encapsulating three very important umbrellas. Let's put it that way, okay? So the things that fall under speculative fiction is everything that's not real, okay? So you've got your horror, your sci-fi, and your fantasy. They're your main speculative fiction genres. Let's get rid of the word speculative fiction. It can go away. No one needs that in their life. Point is, we're not writing memoirs. So, leading on from that, the main subgenres I seem to have problems with is with paranormal romance and dystopian and really everything in between. I have a problem with a lot of things right now. I have a lot of problems. And I have some good examples too. Let me get the books. We're going to be talking about these two books. Right here. For however long this takes for me to clear it up in my mind. Right. So, I finished my biscuits. Let's get serious. The problem that I have has derived from my overarching problem that has existed for years with the Goodreads categories or genres on the side of the book page. I really wish that Goodreads had voting for that, but also just like the actual official genres. Are books published with official genres? That would be really helpful if they did that. But my main problem with subgenres is if you are writing down what genre a book is it like a little tree of happiness where we're writing this is speculative fiction, this is science fiction, and within that branch it is dystopian? Or if it's dystopian, you just say dystopian, who cares where it's derived from, this is the end result. We're currently reading dystopian fiction. Is it important to denote whether it's fantastical dystopian or science fiction dystopian? Is that an important thing that we need to discuss? Is that necessary? Do you think you need to write the main genre when you're categorizing a book, or do you just write the subgenre and forget the main genre? Personally, that would really piss me off. In my opinion, I think I'd like to see a nice breakdown of where we've come from and how we got there. That would be good. So, doing some research online, it would seem that paranormal fiction is causing me a lot of problem in particular, because you search for paranormal fiction and Google automatically spits back paranormal romance at you. Which leads me to the second question: can the paranormal genre exist just as paranormal, or does it have to be a subgenre of romance? Does it have to be paranormal romance, or can you have a story that is paranormal without the romance? What is paranormal? Paranormal are things that usually defy scientific explanation. Like, angels, right? That's kind of what it is. It's taking it a bit further from sci-fi. It's going, no, your math skills can't hurt me here. But at the same time, I don't recall reading a paranormal fiction book that didn't have a romance story to it, but being someone who reads a lot of young adult fiction, I tend to just never define anything as romance anymore because every book ever in the young adult category has some sort of romantic interest. In fact, screw that, let's look at what defines paranormal. Hey Siri, define paranormal.
Denoting events or phenomena such as telekinesis or clairvoyance that are beyond the scope of normal scientific understanding.
Okay. So I think the point that Dear Siri is trying to make here is that, yes, we're looking at something beyond science fiction. Does that make it no longer science fiction? Because here's my problem with this book here, the one that I'm holding upside down and back to front for you. This book by Susan E. is called Angelfall. Let's have a look at the cover so we can appreciate the evil that has taken over this world. Now my problem with this book, okay, is that when I was looking for those sci-fi books to talk to you about, a video which will be coming in the future at some point, if you're interested, is that I wanted to add this one to my list. This book, okay, no spoilers, just an explanation. This book is set in a post-apocalyptic world because angels have descended from the heavens and have started ruining everything ever known to mankind, meanwhile using human doctors to do some pretty horrific genetic alteration experiments, okay? That's a nice little summary of the main elements we're having there, but at the same time we have a romantic interest. We have the main character, whose name I cannot remember, and a guy called Raph, whose name I do remember, and if you read the book you'll probably remember him too. He's an angel, however, so she's falling in love with an angel. She has feelings for an angel. There's clearly tension happening for all 3 books of the trilogy, which is very good, despite my problems with trying to put it into a genre. My problem is that when I go onto iBooks, which is kind enough to tell you what genre that book is, it just said paranormal and I threw everything into the air and went, but what type of paranormal? Is it science fiction or is it fantasy? Because if you look on Goodreads for this particular book, there are 3,000 users who have defined it as fantasy, which is the top category it's been put into. The next one down is paranormal, and then the next one at 1,000 users is science fiction, and I don't understand why. Why is science fiction not the overarching thing? As I explained in my previous video about genres, which are clearly a topic I should just stay away from, is that science fiction, one of the key elements to understanding whether it's science fiction is that it has genetic alteration in it, which means you might be a robot, you might have something change you, something's happened, blah 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 blah, you might have time travel. There's lots of things that make up science fiction, and as someone really nice and simple put it, science fiction could be real, fantasy is not. That's a good way of putting it. So could Angelfall in any sense of the world be real? And I want to say, no, of course not, there's angels in it, right? But at the same time you're going, but the life situation could be, if it wasn't an angel apocalypse, everything else that's happening is quite real. So we're going to talk this out until I work out exactly what's going wrong with this very silly paranormal genre. According to several websites, it seems that paranormal falls under the subgenre of romance, but is described as a combination of the main speculative fiction categories of horror, science fiction, and fantasy. So does that mean we are getting a book with like 4 main genres in it? We're getting horror, we're getting sci-fi, we're getting fantasy, and we're getting romance. Like, that's just insane if that's what's happening. But I'm not happy to say that this book is 100% fantasy, nor that this book is 100% sci-fi. But, if we're going with that definition, that paranormal fiction is a combination of those 3 things, then I guess I do have to accept that at the end of the day, I can't push it further than saying it's a romantic book in the paranormal category, even though that burns my heart, because I want to tell people if it is a sci-fi or a fantasy book. If fantasy is something that cannot be real at all, it's completely imagined, there's no real situation that magic could exist, etc, etc, then yeah, this book is fantasy, because angels don't exist, at least in the form that they are being presented in. We're talking about the author's particular take on a creature that she has labelled an angel. So they're not very realistic, and they are the direct cause of the apocalypse, therefore it's a fantasy book because everything about it is fantastical except for the fact that it's set on Earth and they're not fighting with magic, they're fighting with swords and weapons and science. And as soon as you say genetic alteration, I say sci-fi, because it has to be sci-fi, right? Like, this is science fiction, and in my mind, it's okay for paranormal creatures such as angels to fit into the sci-fi bracket. That is how my mind works. Does paranormal denote sci-fi rather than fantasy? Or is paranormal independent of those genres? See, my then problem is that if you have paranormal, and paranormal books involve paranormal creatures, which are beyond the definition and explanation of science, it's never going to be science, it's always going to be fantasy. The two definitions don't cross over. You can't have something that is beyond explanation and therefore fantasy, but surely you can't just have paranormal fiction outside of the science fiction bubble. Right? Maybe I've got this wrong. Maybe I've got this very wrong, but it just doesn't seem it. Paranormal books read like sci-fi but are defined by fantasy. Is that what we're going for here? Because then, one moment, if we take a look at this book called Half-Blood by Jennifer L. Armentrout, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, this one's also paranormal, okay? And the plot of this one is the people in it are sort of like descended from demigods. So they're not demigods themselves, but they have a touch of godlike powers and can do great things, which means that gods usually fall into the category of mythology, and mythology would usually fall into the category of fantasy, right? Therefore it's fantasy paranormal because people are paranormal and there are paranormal creatures in it, or supernatural creatures in it, but it still falls under the fantasy category because we're talking about great gods. Alright, so according to Google, fantasy centers on magic and magical creatures. Paranormal fiction involves supernatural creatures such as witches, ghosts, vampires, psychics, and werewolves. You didn't give me... You just said magic. You just defined that with magical creatures. For example, if you take away the sparkling, gorgeous vampire or vengeful ghost, and you are left with everyday earth, your story is paranormal fiction. But if you still have a magical element to it, then it's not so. This is a revelation happening. If I take the archangels out of Susan E.'s book and go, what am I left behind with? I'm left with Earth. There's a lot of stuff going on, but I'm left with Earth, which means it's definitely paranormal, which I already knew. If I have books such as Susan E.'s Angelfall, which I would say is significantly more sci-fi-esque than something like Sabaa Tahir's An Ember in the Ashes, which is also dystopian, but it's fantasy. People have magic, and there's no sci-fi present at all. We can definitely say that dystopia is very happy to share the sci-fi and fantasy genre as two separate entities, but, you know, can work in either one. Paranormal just seems to be having a lot of problems. But see where my other problem comes from. Once we start to break down paranormal, we're kind of leaning more towards saying, well, actually, this is paranormal fantasy. Oh my god. This is how I'm gonna die. I can't define my genres. This is such a headache. Can we, like... someone save me. The lines are so blurred, it's gonna murder my soul. I don't think this argument's gonna get anywhere. Right, we're abandoning the internet and we're going off our own thoughts. What have we got so far? You could just say that anything that is not normal is paranormal, okay? We're not gonna do that. We're not gonna do that. We're gonna say, we're only gonna categorize books that are in the paranormal genre if it's a significant part of the story. This is paranormal dystopia. According to my definition, if it's overwhelmingly paranormal, we're gonna have to put it into that genre. It needs to be defined that it's a paranormal book, it's about paranormal elements. And we know that paranormal is beyond sci-fi. And we also know that fantasy is beyond sci-fi. So according to the breakdown of definitions we have, despite the fact that there are sci-fi elements in this book, it is a fantasy world, and knowing that paranormal in and of itself draws from the three main speculative fiction categories of sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, it's okay for it, even if it is leaning more towards one of them than the other, to share from all of them. Therefore, because it's beyond explanation in this one, because there are literally archangels coming down and fighting, I am going to say that Susan E.'s series is paranormal dystopian fantasy. The point of today's rambling video, that I'm so glad you were here so I could talk myself out of it, is that it's really hard to define books. I am probably not going to continue going through my Goodreads shelf because that has caused me so many problems. But at the end of the day, we've learnt a few things here. Books can and will straddle an annoying variety of genres sometimes. However, we as readers are not obliged to list down every element in the book and recognise it as a genre. We are allowed to say there are elements of all these things in here, but to give you the overall idea of what the book is, this is the genre that is most prominent throughout the story. So we have our speculative fiction categories that will give us headaches till the cows come home. We have sci-fi, we have fantasy, and we have horror. Horror, I feel, is usually fairly easy to work out, and we're just going to ignore its existence for now. Sci-fi doesn't need magic, fantasy does. Sci-fi could be real, fantasy is not. Therefore, if we have books with elements in it that are a main plot driving factor and are paranormal, therefore beyond the explanation of science, even without the presence of magic, I think it is okay to say, yep, this is a paranormal fantasy, because we've gone beyond. We've moved past science and we've started imagining something new. If we are talking about paranormal elements that are genetically created and therefore potentially plausible within the sci-fi spectrum, I would say, yeah, you can say that one is a paranormal science fiction story. So there we have it. That is the conclusion to these ramblings. I can now happily define these books. And I'm going to leave it there. Before I think of another book that's going to cause me headaches, I have come to peace with what the hell paranormal fiction is. I've accepted that paranormal is a confusing genre, but I think at the end of the day I have now equipped myself with the ability to tell you what type of paranormal it is. However, I'm still going to ruffle my feathers if people continue to call it paranormal romance, because I believe that you can absolutely have stories that are paranormal and driven by that paranormal plotline without there being romance in it. Now that that's settled, I will see you in my next video. Goodbye.